Before we begin, we would like to ask all participants a question using the polling feature. This will help the presenter learn more about the audience and cater the presentation to the attendees. So you should be seeing the quick poll now. Please take a moment to select your answer. Okay, we are closing out that poll and we will share the responses. Currently, it looks like 60% of you, the attendees, do have a continuity planning policy in place at your institution. Great, this will be wonderful information for Matthew to use during the presentation today. Thank you for answering. Okay, so let's get started. I'm so pleased to introduce our presenter today, Matthew Hart of Tufts University. Matthew Hart has been employed by Tufts University since 2011, working in the Office of Emergency Management as both a continuity planning specialist and, more recently, as the emergency management specialist. Matt has a Bachelor of Science in Emergency Management from Massachusetts Maritime Academy and is a certified emergency manager. Matt has served as a Kuali Foundation member, helping to shape the feature set you see today in a ready product. We are very excited to have him share his broad experiences in forging a path to institutional resilience at Tufts University. Okay, Matthew, let's have you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Becky. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been through here at Tufts in terms of continuity planning. We've been working on it for about 6 years now. It really kind of started in 2009 with H1N1, like I think for many of you it might have been similar, considering continuity of operations planning, but we didn't really pick it back up until about 2011. And we've learned a lot throughout that time, and we didn't always have the success that we have found more recently. So I hope that I can share with some of you what we did learn so you can avoid some of the mistakes that we made and take what worked for us and hopefully apply it at your own institutions. I think the story of Sisyphus is an appropriate metaphor for continuity planning in higher education. It's something that I think a lot of people love to do, but it falls to the back burner more often than not from what I hear of colleagues because there's not always the support that that we like. And really the theme of this presentation is about executive buy-in. I think everything boils down to that. I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised at the 60% number of attendees that have institutional continuity planning policies. That's a great thing to hear, but it also sounds to me like 40% of you don't, and it sounds like maybe 40% of you would like something like that. So maybe some of the things we talk about today will help you to get that executive buy-in and maybe policy or some other mandate from your institution. So the executive buy-in is going to go throughout this presentation. It's going to feed into really 3 different parts: problem, solution, and implementation. It's important for us to identify first that there's a problem at our institutions, and that problem is not performing continuity planning or not having developed a mature continuity planning program. I think it's a need, and I think that if we're good stewards of the institution, continuity planning is something that all institutions should be doing. But once we've identified there's a problem and we get other people to agree with us that it is a problem, we then need to help develop a solution. So talking about what that solution is or can be and how we pitch that. Then finally, implementation. That's a whole other step. So once you've solved the problem, at least in theory, you still have to do it. And I think that's what we'll talk about for implementation. So for problem, one of the things that I think is important to communicate and for people to understand is what continuity planning really is. We can talk in big terms. We can talk about business impact analysis and recovery time objectives and all this other jargon, but that's not going to be helpful if we're trying to communicate to people who might not know what this is or might not know that really they do this every day anyway, whether they know it or not. So this came from, first heard this from Paul Diamond, a name that some of you may be familiar with, but I think this really sums up what continuity planning is all about. Continuity planning helps you to do tomorrow what you're doing yesterday, no matter what happens today. People are always thinking about, what happens if a certain staff member was suddenly unavailable or you know, backing up their computer in a certain way. People are thinking about these kind of things, but there's not really a formal process all the time for them to document and their thinking and do it in a more organized manner. And I think that's what a program is really all about. Another question is, why is this important? I don't know if this is a question that people would directly ask, but I think it's important to communicate why this is important. And here at Tufts, we chose several different things that have happened over the years to communicate the value and the importance of continuity planning. And at each of your institutions, I think it's important that you look back and use things that are relevant to your institution and that people might be familiar with there. So a lot of these things I'll be talking about here, it might be unique to Tufts, but if you translate it to your institution, I think you'll understand how it may be helpful. This first photo here, this slide and many of the slides for this presentation we've used in different times throughout the past several years to communicate different things, and these next four are communicating why it's important. This is a photo from 1975 when a fire destroyed Barnum Hall on our main undergraduate campus here in Medford in Somerville, and it destroyed the life's work of many researchers, but it also destroyed, more notably, Jumbo, who was our mascot, an early trustee of Tufts University, or Tufts College, I should say. It was P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey's circus fame. And after Jumbo died in a tragic train accident, or so the story goes, his hide essentially was donated to the university, and it was destroyed in this fire. So this is an incident that everyone's familiar with. It's part of the lore of Tufts, but it's also a continuity issue as well. So this photo is from our rural Grafton campus where our veterinary school is, and it's representative of a power outage that occurred in 2002. It was a 2-week-long power outage. Both the lines that fed power to the campus were damaged and degraded to the point that they were no longer operational and they had to be replaced. So it was a 2-week period. Luckily it was in the summer, but that's something that's a little more recent and that people can think back to and know that that's a realistic possibility. This photo is representative of a manhole fire that severed the data connection to our downtown Boston Health Sciences campus, and they were without access to the internet and patient records for a period of about 36 hours. This was in the summer of 2004. And lastly, something I think we all dealt with was 2009 H1N1 when we were preparing for about 40% absenteeism. It didn't get to that point, but that's a safe planning assumption that we need to be prepared for. So by relaying back to true stories, things that have happened to your institution that people can remember and relate to is an important way for them to recognize that this is a valuable thing to do, continuity planning. Question that you might get is, don't we already have an emergency plan? We have gotten that question. I think now we're at a point where people understand the difference between emergency planning and continuity planning. But one way that we conveyed that was this visual here. On the left, you'll see that downward facing red arrow, and that's some theme or branding that we use on our prior version of our emergency operations plan, something that people are familiar with. Also use that branding with our alert system. So the left side here is representative of emergency planning, and the right side is continuity planning. Some of the parallels here, the scope is a little different for each of these. It's important people understand that the scope for emergency planning is more major incidents, emergencies and disasters, whereas continuity planning include day-to-day disruptions. As I said earlier, a hard drive that might crash or a burst pipe over somebody's office. Those wouldn't rise to the level of being handled by your emergency operations plan, but they would certainly be handled by a continuity plan. The goals here are also different. Emergency planning, we're talking about saving lives, protecting property. And continuity planning, we're looking at just carrying on and continuing our most critical functions. So I think it's most easily summed up where a typical action or an example action for emergency planning is evacuation of a building or part of your campus. In continuity planning, a typical action would be identification of alternate facilities. So to help people really understand that these are distinct programs. So now if it comes time to identify the solution, we've figured out, well, we need to do some continuity planning, but how do we do that? Isn't business continuity complicated? I think a lot of people have that impression, and it's not wrong. Business continuity, particularly in large corporate environments, is a very complex animal. This is a busy slide, and it's meant to be busy because it represents what people think of when they think of business continuity. But it used to be difficult, is what we use to get buy-in here. If everyone's familiar with TurboTax, you collect your 1099, W-2s, all your financial documents, and you answer the questions, and it gives you a completed return. Well, we compare that to, in our case, Kuali, and I know there's competing products that do similar things, and let people know that this is manageable. This is something that can be done, and it's not overwhelming. Kuali, in this case, we let people know it really only does 3 things. We're trying to take people's anxiety away. We're trying to lessen that anxiety around continuity planning. If they can collect information that already exists, answer questions with their institutional knowledge without doing any sort of research or legwork, and then identify actions for improving continuity down the road. Not solving the problems now, but figuring out what can you do now to be better prepared tomorrow, and maybe we'll do that a year from now. We don't have to do it now. If they can do these 3 things, then they can develop a complete continuity plan. Another thing we do is identify peer and aspirant institutions that use the similar product, in this case Kuali. This is a slide that was developed a while ago. I'm not sure if everyone on this slide is still using Kuali, but it goes to show that this is a popular tool across higher education, and if others are using it, then maybe there's something to it. It's important for us to really push this planning down to the lowest levels of the institution, to the department and the office level, because that's where all the institutional knowledge is really housed. If if a consultant was to come in and develop continuity plans for our institution at the department level, those plans would be no good. Nobody understands how dining services or how technology services or all these different departments work other than the people in them, the manager level in those groups. So if we need effective plans, and if we want effective plans, they need to be doing the planning themselves, and they need to be actively engaged in the process. What are we planning for? That's a very common question. People are so used to having plans for all different hazards, whether it's a fire plan or a hurricane plan, now, with all hazard planning, it's not the approach that we use anymore, but how do we communicate what all hazard planning is and how that's applicable here to somebody who's not in our profession? This is a slide is something we created to do just that. Kuali helps us to prepare for resource shortages, if you will, and ask you, how will you perform your functions without your personnel, your space, your equipment and supplies, and your IT infrastructure? And if you answer those questions for those 4 resources, you've answered it for any sort of hazard you can imagine, whether it's fire, flood, anything affects one or more of those 4 resources. So if you plan for those 4 things to be without them, then you've planned for everything. And this helps people to understand that this is much more manageable than it might have been otherwise if they had to plan for multiple hazards. What will the planning process do for us? A lot of times people expect the plan to tell them what to do. Do 1, 2, 3 in order. And that's not what continuity planning is about to me. I think the only sequential step is, how do you get in touch with each other? How do you communicate among your team or your department? So some metaphors that we've used that I think people can relate to is a pantry where you have all these options available to you. Another one we looked at is a playbook. There's many options. Then a roadmap. It's not step-by-step directions, but it's a map with many different routes to get from point A to point B. So ultimately, it's XYZ, not 1, 2, 3. the planning process helps to identify coping strategies. If you cross-train people in a certain skill, you don't need a piece of paper to tell you that people are cross-trained. It just becomes part of your institutional knowledge. So it'll be natural for them to know how to respond and how to continue their critical functions because it'll be part of what they do. So the solution was availability of a continuity planning tool that was developed by higher education for higher education and its availability. But now we got to implement it. So how do we prioritize our effort? We, throughout the years, have prioritized continuity planning in several different ways. I'm going to talk about two right now, and then I'll show you what we've been doing more recently in a little bit. So the mission of the university is teaching, research, and patient care. And yes, that's a very non-traditional patient with our veterinary school and our veterinary hospitals. But that's the mission of the university, but not many people in the enterprise are directly involved with the delivery of that mission in the teaching, the research, and the patient care. There are many other support services that all of that relies on, whether it's technology services or facility services or other groups. And if they're not operating, none of the other enterprise is going to be able to continue its functions. So in recognition of that, we initially developed some criteria for goals for completed continuity plans. We did 30% of our academic departments, 60% of our laboratory research departments, and 90% of our support departments. And again, that's in recognition that the support departments everyone relies on, very heavily dependent on those departments. So if we can prepare those departments, it'll enable the rest of the university to continue operating. But we also recognize later on that that's not the most precise criteria for continuity planning. So we developed, in this list grew from the first 5 to then eventually 8 different criteria with different point values for each. So if a department failed to perform any of its critical functions, it would have an immediate impact on life, health, or security. It would get 3 points. If many other departments depended on it, it would get 2, and so on. We worked with our institutional research and evaluation group to not only identify a list of departments, but then what criteria each met. And again, these are just a couple options that you might be able to use or take back with you. I think all of this that I'm going through today is very institution dependent. It's also personality dependent, culture dependent. There's lots of factors that play into what will work at your institution. So maybe this will be helpful for you. How were plans developed? So as I said earlier, we've been doing this for about 6 years, and for the first 2 or so, this is how we developed the plans. I would meet with the head of the unit. That's me on the slide, if you couldn't tell. And we would meet with the head of the unit, and I would just do the data entry. I'd ask the questions that are in the tool. I'd type it in, and then we'd have a completed plan. But that's not effective at all. If you ask them a couple months later if they had a continuity plan, they probably would say, oh, no, I don't think so. So they really weren't involved in the process, and really the planning, it's more about the process than the plan itself at the end. It's the conversations that they have amongst themselves trying to figure out how they would cope with certain situations and what strategies would be most helpful for them. So we recognized that this wasn't effective. So the next step was we tried to pitch it or position it as a web-based self-service tool, which it is, with a one-on-one consultation, where I would meet with the head of the unit again, introduce them to the tool, answer any questions they may have, and then send them on their way. But again, that wasn't super effective because this would always fall to the back burner, understandably, because priorities are set by administration, priorities are set by senior leaders. And if this isn't on their radar, then it won't be on the radar of the managers who report to them. And that's a reality, and that's really how it should work. So there's nothing wrong with that. But this wasn't effective because we didn't quite have that executive buy-in yet. So coming back to the executive buy-in, now today we have a continuity planning policy approved at the university. We worked it through our emergency management program committee, and it was approved by academic council last May. And it requires all departments that are identified in our emergency operations plan as having been assigned emergency responsibilities in that plan to develop a continuity plan. We also did kind of a 1 degree of separation type deal, where any departments that those departments rely on for their most critical functions, they also have to do a plan. So we also included in here a requirement to have a tabletop exercise to validate the plans initially. So when they're first developed, a simple tabletop to test it out. And then initial approval we also decided would be at the level of the senior leadership, so the executive dean or the vice president. And that was mostly for visibility and as well as review of the plan. But after that, these plans are truly owned and managed by the head of the unit and by the organization itself. So this is from our emergency operations plan. These are the departments that are required by that policy to develop plans. Right now, we have just completed developing about 30 or so plans for all these departments here and then a few others. And they'll be approved within a month. And then we'll start doing those 1 degree of separations plans. So whoever these folks depend on will also have to develop plans. What would we do differently if we could go back? I think we would earlier on seek that policy, and that's why I'm glad 60% of you have a policy. I think that that's made the world of difference. It's made it a priority for the managers and for the people who it needs to be a priority for. So I think that's great, and I think the way we did it with stakeholder input and using our university-wide emergency management program committee to develop that plan and then to eventually get it approved at the highest level of academic council was incredibly helpful. So where do we go from here? Right now we're working on a university continuity of operations plan, which is more of a governance document over the department level continuity plans. And then we'll continue to develop those 1 degree of separation plans, and then the schools and divisions across the university can also set their own obligations for continuity planning. That was built into the policy as well. So we'll help those departments that are required by their vice president or their executive dean to develop plans. And once we have that set of data, we'll be able to inform other planning, whether it's disaster recovery with information technology or alternate space identification. We'll be able to do a lot more with that data. So right now, we're really happy with where we're at. And one thing that I want to stress too is really interested to see where the Kuali product goes from here. In the past, Kuali has always been known as the very simple tool that anyone can use, log in, create an effective continuity plan. But now with the transition to Kuali.co, I'm really interested to see where that goes. The support has been really great, better than I think it has before in the previous organizational structure of Kuali. So I think that within a year or two, once we have all these plans developed, I'm interested to see what capabilities that the tool will have at that point. But I can't speak highly enough of Kuali and Becky and the team. It's been great working with them. So at this point, this is, again, you might remember Sisyphus from the earlier slide, and hopefully this presentation has made that slope a little less for you. And with that, I would like to open up to any questions.
Great. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing your experiences in clearing the hurdles and implementing BCP at your institution. We truly appreciate your efforts in preparing this presentation and also just being so willing to share your expertise. So we've got a few questions that have come in, but attendees, please take this opportunity to submit more. Also, feel free to submit a question even if you want a personal answer. Just note it as private and we can get back to you directly. Okay, so let's jump into some questions. How big is your team? What roles exist and what responsibilities are shared across those people? Can you tell us more about your team?
Yeah, so in terms of FTEs for emergency management and business continuity, it's really, we have 2 FTEs doing emergency management. We have a director of emergency management and an emergency management specialist, which is myself. And I would say about 30% of my time is toward continuity planning. We've built the program in a way that really the departments are responsible for it, with workshops where we introduce the tool in 3 different workshops, introduce a little part here, one at a time, and really try to push as much of that effort onto them as possible, with making support available all the time. But really the data entry and the development of the plan is up to the departments, and that's really worked well for us. They've really taken charge and run with it. So yeah, so we have 2 FTEs, both 30% of, or 0.3 FTEs on continuity planning.
Got it. So you, in that response, mentioned training. Can you talk to our attendees more about how you did training for understanding BCP, but also for using the tool itself?
Yeah, so we did a series of 3 workshops, and each workshop was offered 3 times, with those 30 or so departments signing up for any of the sessions that they would like to attend. And the first one, we walked through introduction to continuity planning, introduction to Kuali Ready, and then identification of critical functions, so the critical function step of the tool. Then the second workshop, we did the information technology step, and the third workshop, we did the key resources. So we didn't cover the instruction step, but that was because there were no academic departments or instructional departments in that process. So each of those workshops about an hour and a half, and I was available throughout then, about 20-30 minutes of instruction or lecture, and then they could work through their plan after the fact while I was available to help them. And that seemed to work really well, and we got good feedback on that. It was the first time that we had done that, and I think that was the best approach that we had used.
Okay, next question. You talked about H1N1. Did Tufts have a business continuity plan in place at that time?
So for H1N1, I was not here in 2009, but there was a pandemic influenza planning subcommittee that was looking at, I'm sorry, there's a pandemic influenza planning committee with a continuity of operations subcommittee, and I think for a couple different business units, continuity of operations plans were developed, including human resources, but I don't think that, I can actually tell you for a fact, there was no comprehensive program that was developed out of that. We purchased the Kuali Ready tool and developed 1 or 2 plans for some important business units, but the program itself hasn't really been implemented until very recently.
Okay. Having a policy does not necessarily mean that a policy can be enforced. Universities are notoriously known for being passive-aggressive with few carrots or sticks regarding compliance. How does Tufts deal with departments that ignore the policy?
That's a good question. We haven't faced that yet. We have, I think some departments really become much more engaged, and I think it might be the personality, but some folks absolutely love this, and some folks I don't think are as interested. But overall, we've had good adoption so far. What we plan to do is, and what's actually written into that policy, which I'll be able to share with everyone and is on our website, is annual reporting from the Office of Emergency Management to senior leadership. And that'll identify departments that are required under the policy or under school or division obligations, and then the status of their plan. And we'll share that with all the senior leaders so that not only they can see how they're doing, but they'll also be able to see their peers. And we hope to create some healthy competition, if you will.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we can't, if it's not a priority to the senior leaders, and if they aren't asking their folks or insisting that their folks develop plans, then there's no reason it should be an obligation for us either. Where, you know, we report to them just like everyone else does. So it's up to them to really set the priorities, and we're lucky here where I think we have a good group that is really engaged with this. But I would suggest you you know, report back to your senior leaders on the status, whether it's good or bad, and then let them decide what they want to do with it.
What is the frequency of that reporting? at your institution?
It's annual. We have yet to submit a first report because we're just now getting through the first plan development through this formal program, but it's an annual report.
Have you seen significant increase in willingness to develop department continuity plans since the creation of the policy?
Could you ask me that? Could you say that again?
Yeah, you bet. Have you seen significant increase in willingness to develop departmental continuity plans since the creation of your policy?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we did was when we first reached out to the departments, we went through the senior leader. So after the policy was developed and the senior leaders were part of the approval of the policy, we didn't reach out directly to the managers responsible for developing the plans. We had the senior leaders ask them to reach out with us. So they had to initiate that communication so that it wasn't us going to them asking them to do something. It was their senior leader asking them to talk to us first. And I think that might have made a difference.
Definitely. Okay, after a disaster, how are departments' plans activated?
So as I talked briefly about, this is a great question. This is something we get a lot from departments, but we see these plans in the planning process as more XYZ, options for how to cope with certain situations, and it's not really an actionable plan. It doesn't tell you to do 1, 2, 3 or to activate. I think a department knows when they, whether you want to call it activation or implementation. If one of their functions just isn't working, or if it's not continuing in the way that it normally operates, they do something, right? That's the next step, and they usually communicate. And I don't know if it's as important to have a set, we're now activated binary criterion for the plan. I see it more as if something happens and you need to change the way you're doing business, how do you communicate with each other? How do you get on a conference bridge? How do you, wake somebody up in the middle of the night? I think that's something that they need to develop a practice for. But usually whatever they do day to day is effective enough, I find.
Okay. Next question. Was there any collaboration between BC planning efforts and DR planning within central IT? Were the IT resource solutions left up to the individual departments?
Yeah, so in the planning tool, there's, and I don't want to assume everyone's very familiar with the tool either. There's 2 pages in the information technology stuff that allows you to identify applications. One is centrally owned applications and one is departmentally owned applications, and they're exactly that. For the centrally owned applications, ones that are owned, managed by our central IT group, we worked with them to develop that list. And it took a little bit of balancing between the way that they identify services and the way that the community identifies services, because not everyone has the same IT familiarity as your IT group does. They might think of a service as something different. It might have a different name, or 2 or 3 services might really be one. So we did a little bit of work there, but we worked with them to identify that list so that the data down the road, once we have a critical mass of plans, is more useful to them. Because hopefully we expect that to inform their disaster recovery planning efforts once they know what level of criticality people place on those applications, so that they have some more objective data than subjective.
Okay. Will you be willing to share your slides after the webinar?
Yes. Yeah, and I think I can share that with you, Becky, and however you want to distribute that.
Perfect. That'd be great. Okay. How do you reach out to other institutions dealing with your same issues? Like, where do you go for peer support?
There's really, for continuity planning specifically, there's really no resource. I think that's something that maybe I think there might be a case for here within the Kuali Ready user community. But in terms of more broadly emergency management, the International Association of Emergency Managers, University and Colleges Caucus, the UCC, is a group of a couple hundred university and college practitioners throughout the country, and that's a really good group. And they also have a repository of documentation that includes a folder for business continuity planning. There might be a dozen documents in there now. A couple things about exercises for validating continuity plans, but I think that's a great resource.
Okay, next. You're very popular. There are many questions here. Does it make sense to do a standalone business impact analysis, or is the BIA very much a component of an overall BCP for a university?
So this is something that I haven't put great thought into. I think it's important to do a BIA to understand where your pain points are, truly where your most critical operations reside. But we have not yet been at a point, and I don't know if we'll be at a point for at least another year, where we'll have the data and the formal program enough to do that. I think that that's an activity that would reside on the same level as your university plan or your institution plan. I don't know if, I think that the department level continuity plans would inform that effort.
Okay. You mentioned a requirement in your policy to have a TTX. Have you had a TTX yet? If so, what has it shown regarding the effectiveness of the continuity plans?
So yeah, we've had probably about a dozen exercises, and about 6 of them, about a half dozen, were group exercises. So we had anywhere from 4 to 7 departments participate and bring their key staff. Each department had their own table to sit at and discuss. And at each of those exercises, we gave 6 different scenarios. We did a winter storm, an extended 2-day closure for a winter storm, and that's pretty simple, and that was just to warm them up. That's something that we're very used to and that everyone here, at least in our environment, knows how to deal with. But we also did an unexpected absence of a key staff member. We did a public health emergency with an epidemic with social distancing and work from home measures for a period of at least a couple weeks, couple months. And what did that do for us? We didn't really evaluate specifically how effective the plans were. I think our goal was more to validate the thoroughness of the plans. So these are the first time these are really being developed by the departments themselves, and we wanted to see if there were any gaps in there. So we gave them some challenging scenarios and asked them, well, look at your plan. Does your plan include how you would handle this? Does the plan address this? And then they would notice some areas where they might need to add this or add that. So I don't know across the board, you know, how well the first pass was, but I think across the board after those exercises, I think the plans were quite thorough and captured just about everything that they needed to.
Next question. Can you elaborate a bit more on the 3 workshops you made available to the different departments to explain the BCP process and what each entailed?
Yeah, so we did, well, I'll start at the beginning then. So we had the senior leaders talk to their folks, their managers who are responsible for units required by the policy to develop plans. They had to reach out to me, and then I essentially helped them to schedule and to pick workshop dates that worked best for everyone. And we did 3 workshops, and each one was about a third of the planning process. So the first workshop, about 20 or 30 minutes, talked about what is continuity planning, what is the policy, what does it require, and then a brief introduction to the continuity planning tool itself, and then a little deeper dive into the critical functions part of the planning tool. Once I gave them that, in that 20 or 30 minutes, I let them give them an hour and a half to just begin developing their own plan for their department, kind of building the framework so that they can then go back to their department over the next 4 or 6 weeks and continue to develop that plan or that part of the plan. Then the second workshop was information technology. similar, maybe 15 minutes showing them the information technology step, some time there in the room while I was available to answer any questions to begin developing that, and then they'd go back to their departments for 4 or 6 weeks to continue working on that, and then the same thing for key resources. So it ended up being about 3 months, 3 or 4 months of a process, and that's actually longer than it really takes to develop one of these plans. I think that if we were to do it again, I'd only give 2 weeks between workshops. I think 4 to 6 weeks might have been a little too much time. Might have fallen off their radar in that time a little bit, but overall it worked really well. The tool is designed so that anyone can log in and create a complete plan without any training, but we think that training, making that available or optional to people is really helpful, and they really appreciated that.
Next question. For a function like campus services, do you do one overarching plan, or do you break something like that up into separate standalone plans, such as one for housing, one for parking, one for food service, etc.?
That's a great question, and it really varies. It depends on the department, how big and complex it is. It depends on, you know, how it's structured, and in our case, we have 4 different campuses, 4 Massachusetts campuses. So for our facility services group, we have a plan for each campus for facilities because of the way that they're structured. Other groups, there's one school that we're working with, and for the entire school, for all their administrative functions, we've created one plan, and each critical function is kind of a different business unit, whether it's career services, financial aid. So we kind of twisted the tool a little bit to make that work, and I think that was more of a first pass, and down the road we're going to break that out and make it a plan for each of those, a plan for career services, a plan for the registrar. But it was a little easier to do it all in one plan for this first pass. So it's pretty flexible, and you can make it work in different ways. You have to balance the needs of the unit, you have to balance the organizational structure of the unit, you have to balance what the tool is capable of, but just about whatever works for you, it can be done.
Okay, so Matthew, we've had about 15 questions for you, and we believe that this is the most we've ever had for a BCP-related webinar. Since you're sharing your email address here, would you mind if attendees connected with you to ask additional questions?
No, absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so thank you again, Matthew, for your time to prepare and present today's webinar. This presentation has been recorded, and a link to it will be emailed to you